pets, and at that time we were unable to identify any other commonalities aside from this raw pet food. So now I'm going to hand this over to virtual Tataran, or Dr. Tataran.
You're on now, Joanne.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting a lot of feedback. Okay, I'll give it a go. So the term raw pet food is generally used to describe pet food that's made from uncooked meat, bones, and organs. Also, of late, in particular, lots of grains, vegetables, fruits, and supplements, things like kelp, also to add vitamins to the product. And the origin of raw pet food actually stems quite a long time, a number of years ago, to a backlash that was against commercially prepared kibble. So there were people out there claiming that it was not a natural replication of animals' wild diet, and that animals who ate raw food, which were primarily meat and organ-based, would have better health, improved coat quality, immune status, longevity, and even claims of curing animals of disease. So this is now, I think these beliefs are really gaining ground, and there's lots of controversy around these claims, and there's actually very little data to support the benefits of feeding a raw food diet. So raw food itself and the feeding of raw food has been around. I remember when I was in vet school back in the 90s hearing about the BARF diet, which stands for biologically appropriate raw foods. But back then, I think it was much more of a niche practice, and predominantly breeders in particular use this practice as quite a lot. But I guess of the last few years, it's really gained some momentum and moved into mainstream culture and society. So the trend has really picked up recently, in particular with a general trend towards health and wellness in humans, and really the humanization of pets and pet foods has had an impact as well. So raw pet food itself can come in a variety of forms. So you can go onto the internet and get a recipe and make it yourself in your home. But there's also been a recent boom in commercially prepared raw pet foods. And there's now even stores entirely dedicated to raw pet food. And maybe some of you have been there, have been to some of these stores. So I just this morning Googled Vancouver and found a couple of stores, I think Simply Natural Raw Pet Food and True Carnivores Raw Food for Cats and Dogs. So actual stores that exclusively sell raw pet food products. And so most raw pet foods, I guess they can be sold fresh, frozen, and also in dehydrated formulations. Another important component of raw food is the trend towards natural pet treats. And so really the difference between a treat and a food is that a treat is not intended to be a nutritionally balanced food, in that you shouldn't feed it to your pet solely. So things like pig ears, duck feet, bull pizzles or penises were kind of, I would consider those historical chew treats. But this area has also boomed and included things now you can go buy 100% pollock snacks for your pets, water buffalo meat, which they claim to be leaner, kelp, quinoa and spinach treats, etc. So most of these natural treats are dehydrated, and so they typically also don't include a cooking or pathogen kill step. Therefore, they're also considered technically raw food. And I guess just to say that the pet food industry itself, I think the estimates in Canada that I had found, which were a little bit old, were around $2 billion a year. And the estimates that I found more recently on the raw pet food industry is to be about 5% of the market share. So I suspect project, it might be a little bit bigger than that, but there's lots of room for this industry to grow. And I think with the interest and the trend of raw pet food, that we will likely see more and more different businesses popping up, kind of jumping on this trend. Can you move to the next slide? Can you hear me okay? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, sorry. Can you move it to the next slide, please?
It's right the
Oh,
other way.
maybe it already has, but it has it on my screen. Oh, there it is. Okay, great.
Back one? Okay.
So intuitively, since a large component of raw pet food is raw meat, we can expect that there are significant pathogen risks associated with these products. Things like Salmonella, toxigenic E. coli, Listeria, Campylobacter, and other pathogens. And this has been demonstrated time and again in a variety of studies. The pathogens can cause the pets themselves to get ill, but oftentimes the animal won't necessarily develop any clinical illness or perhaps only mild illness, but they can go on to become colonized with the pathogenic bacteria and shed it. So there was one study that looked at dogs that were used for human therapy, found that the practice of feeding raw food, those dogs were 23 times more likely to shed salmonella compared to dogs that were not fed raw food. And so what has been demonstrated as well is that these animals can shed intermittently for a number of months, thus providing an ongoing risk for household members. And so in particular, who we are most concerned about would be members of the public of our vulnerable populations. So those that are at higher risk for more severe illness, including children, and in particular kids under 5, immunocompromised persons, and the elderly. And many of these people are an important part of our pet-owning households. So a study by Jason Stahl in 2012 in Waterloo, Ontario, found that 64% of households they interviewed had a pet, and of those, 55% had members comprising a vulnerable population. And so I find this statistic really interesting as a veterinarian, and thinking about those veterinarians in practice when asked about the merits versus the risks of feeding raw food diets. I think it's an important thing for veterinarians to consider when they're discussing with their clients who's in the household. Children in particular are often overrepresented in animal-related outbreaks for a variety of reasons. So kids under 5 in particular don't tend to have fully developed immune systems, and therefore themselves can develop a more severe illness. And also, of course, children are more likely to get sick due to their behaviors, such as less hand washing, close commingling with pets, and probably any of you with kids out there know that kids are at the ideal height for face licking and love to pretend to be a puppy, drinking out of water bowls, etc. And also, kids have more hand-to-mouth contact. So with regards to outbreaks associated with raw pet food and treats, there have been a number of pet treat outbreaks over the years, and there's a few listed on this slide, some notable ones in Canada, including a couple of Salmonella infantis outbreaks associated with pork products. Interestingly, there have been virtually no outbreaks or clusters reported associated with raw pet food, and I guess we can speak to that. There'll be some maybe discussion as to why it is. We think that might be the case. I guess as a result of some of these investigations, there have been recalls also conducted. So the U.S. in particular does do active surveillance on pet food, and a number of raw pet food and pet treat recalls have been done over the years, and there have also been a few done more recently in Canada.
Thanks, Joanne.
All right. Just some background about Salmonella 4.5.12i before I present to you the provincial picture of this outbreak. Hello? Yes, okay. Thank you. So provincially, the same, Jillian called us the day, or emailed us the day that they identified the potential outbreak in interior health. And when we looked back, we found 5 cases of Salmonella 4.5.12i- during that same time period. The 3 in Interior Health Authority and 2 in Fraser Health Authority. The 3 we've already heard about in IH had raw pet food exposure. For the 2 cases in Fraser Health, 1 case had a cat, and this is all based on the information that's available during the first interview with the case, and which is reported in the electronic public health information system called Panorama. The first case had been interviewed in Fraser and had a cat, but did not mention having exposure to any raw pet food products. The second Fraser Health case had not yet been interviewed. So we informed our laboratory and put them on the alert to look out for the specific pulse-filled gel electrophoresis patterns for those cases of interest. So about a week later, they shared this information with us. The 3 Interior Health Authority cases had the same PFGE pattern. They had the same DNA fingerprint, and that formula is given there. The 2 Fraser Health cases that we were following had 2 different PFGE patterns from each other and from the outbreak strain. However, the lab looked back at their data and found that there was another case in Fraser Health from December that had the same PFGE pattern as the 3 cases from Interior Health Authority. And this PFGE pattern had never been reported before in British Columbia, so it was new to us, new and rare, and had not been reported in Canada either. So at this point, we'd had a few meetings, both with our laboratory partners as well as with Interior Health and Fraser Health Authority public health inspectors and medical health officers. And people were now very aware and very conscious of a raw pet food connection and were on the lookout for that particular suspect product. So over the next week or so, both Interior Health and Fraser Health noted a number of enteric disease human illnesses which had had an exposure to raw pet food. The Salmonella 4.5.12i- case from Fraser from December had raw pet food exposure. Their cat had been fed raw pet food. There was a Salmonella enteritidis case from Interior Health from April, which had exposure to raw pet food. Another Salmonella, a Salmonella brandup case in Fraser, also in April, which had raw pet food exposure, and an E. coli 0157H7 case in Interior, which had fed its pet raw pet food. So all of a sudden, in a very short time frame, there were a number of cases which had exposure to the potentially suspect food product, raw pet food. At this point, there was no information on whether the products were similar or not. So you can imagine our confusion around what this outbreak was composed of. Was this a 4.5.12i- outbreak? Was it a raw pet food outbreak that was contaminated with multiple pathogens, multiple serotypes of Salmonella, multiple enteric pathogens? And so we'd like to pause here and ask you what you think. Which of these cases should be included in our outbreak, and what would your outbreak case definition be? So we'll pause now. We'll give you 5 minutes to discuss these questions at your table, and then we'll come back to plenary and get your thoughts. I'll give you the last slide back again.